And this is a very important issue for the Baha'i community because we believe that as long as women are prevented from attaining their highest possibilities, so long will men be unable to achieve the greatness which might be theirs.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. In 1995, there was a landmark meeting on gender equality in Beijing called the Fourth World Conference on Women. The conference produced the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which was a highly influential blueprint for advancing women's rights. It was at this conference that then First Lady Hillary Clinton famously declared,
"Let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all."
Last week at the United Nations General Assembly, there was a 30-year commemoration of this landmark conference, which has become a touchstone for advocates around the world, in particular from civil society. And today, I'm joined by two of those advocates, Bani Dugal and Liliane Nkunzimana, who are representatives of the Baha'i International Community to the United Nations. They explain why that conference 30 years ago was so significant, how it is impacting debates on gender equality today, and how to continue to advance gender equality in the profoundly different geopolitical context we are in 30 years since that conference. Today's episode is produced in partnership with the Baha'i International Community, an NGO that represents the worldwide Baha'i community at the UN and other international forums, where it says that recognizing humanity's interconnectedness is key to a shared global future. The Baha'i International Community recently released the book, In Full Partnership, 30 Years of Women's Advancement at the United Nations and Beyond, which honors the 30 years since the landmark Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing and the creation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. You can find the book at bic.org. Now here is my conversation with Bani Dugal and Liliane Nkunzimana. So we are speaking just after High Level Week, one of the highlights of which was the 30th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women and the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action. Now, this is a jargon-laden, yet very meaningful issue around the United Nations. Can I just have you explain what that means, what that was?
As you mentioned, it was the Fourth World Conference on Women, the first one being in Mexico City, which was also around the time when the Decade on Women was launched. And the first treaty, which is known as the CEDAW Treaty, was negotiated soon after. The CEDAW Treaty is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And that launched an awareness and global policy making for the advancement of women. The Mexico conference was followed by Copenhagen and Nairobi, and then the Beijing conference. The Beijing conference was very significant, both in the substance that it brought to the international community and solidified the concept of women's rights being human rights, and had this far-reaching agenda and policy agenda, which is what governs governments and their work and their policies for gender equality even today. The timing of the Fourth World Conference was significant because it was soon after the Cold War had ended. And the governments around the world in the 90s, there was a much more conciliatory atmosphere, and we had a number of far-reaching global policy agendas that were drafted at that time. There was the Copenhagen Conference on Social Development, there was the Vienna Conference on Human Rights, there was the Beijing Conference on Gender Equality, which was followed soon after by the ICPD, which was the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, which picked up some of the issues that the Beijing Conference had not been able to get to, like women's sexual reproductive health and rights. So the Beijing Conference was a very significant moment for the governments that were thinking about drafting global policy for gender equality, but also in particular for civil society, because it galvanized all of the local and national initiatives that women had been playing in order to advance gender equality and the status of women, but brought these networks into a global initiative. And we now had this energized global women's movement.
I think maybe just one thing that I can say in terms of Beijing, I was 3 years old when that conference happened. So I think for those individuals who are now in this movement, when we hear stories about Beijing and all the work that was done leading up to Beijing, it really serves as an encouragement and as a source of motivation to continue doing the work. There's so many stories about like all the mud, all the consistent rain, and 50,000 people who were gathering, both the official delegation and civil society, people who were on trains for days going to Beijing. So I think when we hear all the sacrifice that people made to make Beijing happen, it really acts as this huge source of motivation for those who are doing the work at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps the most well-known moment from that Beijing conference was Hillary Clinton, then the First Lady of the United States, declaring women's rights are human rights are women's rights, once and for all. And Bani, as you noted, that conference in that moment really was a catalytic event for many civil society organizations. What did it mean specifically for the Baha'i International Community?
So this conference was a culmination of the Baha'i International Community's efforts, because we had the Baha'i International Community's UN office was present all through, from Mexico City to Copenhagen, Nairobi, and now Beijing. And my predecessor at this office, Mary Power, was leading civil society at the conference. She was chairing the NGO committee on the status of women at the time and was part of the global organizing committee. So she was the civil society representative at that global organizing committee for the conference and played a very active role in facilitating the participation of tens of thousands of women and men from civil society that participated at Beijing. For many, it was a first time, a first toe in the water of this conversation of gender equality. For others, there were long-standing feminists and activists who had been working on these issues for decades before, some even before the UN was founded. So it was, a culmination of all those efforts. And for the Baha'i International Community, it was a very important moment because Baha'is gender equality, or the equality of women and men, is inherent in our faith. It is a spiritual principle for us. So for Baha'is who had understood this at a level of principle, were now seeing the entire world together in Beijing and around those that weren't able to come to Beijing. There was this buzz about the concept of gender equality and what it meant. And the Beijing conference was very significant in that it allowed for certain conversations which up until then were only whispered about, like traditional practices that were harmful to women or women's health. And these were things that anyone out of that region had never even heard of. And I'm alluding to FGM, female genital mutilation, in some parts of the world. Of course, we'd heard of foot binding in other parts of the world, or even the right of a man to chastise his wife or women in the household through violence, were concepts that weren't often spoken about in public. And this was a conference that allowed women to be able to articulate these challenges, but even hope for a better world for themselves and the generations to come. So, the critical area of concern on violence against women actually addressed issues of domestic violence, which up until today, some member states do not want to have part of the global discussions at CSW, and we hear pushback. So it was a very significant moment for Baha'is, but for women, of course, all around the world.
So, Lily, earlier you mentioned that you were just 3 years old in 1995 when the Beijing conference was held. But I'm wondering, can you draw a straight line to your work today, to some of the elements contained in the Declaration and the Platform of Action? And how does your work today reflect that initial moment 30 years ago?
For many young women who are in the world of work today, there's certain things that perhaps we take for granted. I've had conversations with my grandmother, and she's told me in the past that during her lifetime, at my age, wouldn't have been able to open a bank account. Or this idea of being able to make choices about when you have a family, about when you get married, about having access to quality education. So I just thinking about all the 12 areas of critical concern that we have to think about. How do we address the issue that often it's women who are adversely affected by issues of poverty, for example? Or how do we address issues of, often in some situations when a family has to make a decision about educating the daughter or the son, it's often the son who gets educated. How do we ensure that even when war breaks out, that we protect the well-being, the human rights of everybody in that situation? I think as Bani was sharing earlier, many of these things that had existed for a long time, but we weren't thinking about the adverse and very particular impact that it had on women, that it brought it to the fore, to the international stage, and there has now been dedicated attention on these issues. And I definitely feel the benefits of that as an individual in the workplace and moving around, navigating the world. As part of it, also being able to be here at the United Nations and talking about these issues and perhaps not addressing the same difficulties as past generations, but continuing the conversation because although much has been accomplished, there's still quite a bit of work to do.
So that actually leads me very nicely into my next question, which is what exactly happened at this high-level meeting commemorating the 30th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women, which took place on the sidelines of UNGA last week. I mean, Bani, earlier you mentioned that kind of like the geopolitical moment in which the Beijing Declaration came to be was one in which there was like broad progress and optimism around the ability, for example, of civil society to advance issues around human rights, around gender equality. As I see it, that kind of same vibe and era does not exist today. We're at a profoundly different moment in which many of the rights that had been gained are potentially on the verge of maybe even being lost. So I'm curious to learn from you, like, what was it like inside that room at the UN last week? And what was accomplished?
The mood was one of commemoration, and the speeches that we heard were those of recognizing the gains that have been made in the past 30 years, of which there have been many. However, we also heard a number of member states stating how we have a long way to go. And then there were some that felt that, yes, maybe our agenda has moved as far as it could, and we don't need to make any further advances. I think I heard some, well, it wasn't quite phrased like that. Lily's looking surprised, but I read that between the lines. And we do hear a number of member states. I think it was at the last Commission on Status of Women that took place in March, there was at least one member state that said human rights is not an overarching objective of the Beijing Plan of Action because there's a specific critical area of concern which talks about human rights of women. So it was, I guess they're just passing words here and using a technicality not to frame the entire agenda as one of human rights, which I would disagree with, and I think most of my sisters and brothers in civil society would disagree with. So there was an upbeat moment of celebration that we've moved 30 years from Beijing, and we have seen some advances. But I think there was definitely a feeling that we haven't gone far enough. We haven't achieved what we had hoped 30 years ago we would have achieved by now. And we are living in times which are very different from what the mid-1990s had, when governments were looking for opportunities to work together. And there was this conciliatory mood at the UN and around the world. Whereas today, unfortunately, we are living in times with a lot of contention, a lot of conflict, and we know that women and children are the ones that suffer disproportionately when there's conflict in the world. And there's a great deal of concern as to where we are headed.
So, Lily, on that point, as a member of civil society in this, as Bani said, contentious moment, particularly, frankly, around gender equality, how do you maintain progress? How do you kind of keep the spirit of Beijing alive?
I mean, as part of this high-level meeting, one of the other achievements that I think we can call it an achievement was that throughout the summer, the Commission on the Status of Women has been going through a process of trying to revitalize the commission. So there's quite a bit of frustration that thousands of activists and those concerned for the status of gender equality in the world come to New York every year in March for this commission. And we have an outcome document, and it is just that it remains a document, and there isn't really any way of implementing the results of the discussions that are had year in, year out, and people feel frustrated, and rightly so. And so I think part of this process and what was announced during the high-level meeting was a resolution to really get member states to start thinking about how do we ensure that this gathering of delegates every year doesn't just become another thing that the UN does that doesn't result in meaningful change. Perhaps we should think about putting in place some kind of mechanism to review progress on these outcome documents that come out of CSW every year. Maybe we should think about how to make CSW more responsive to some of these critical issues that come up every single year that women feel really frustrated at. For example, violence against women is something that people would like to see on the agenda of every single CSW. How do we make sure that those who are not able to afford to come to New York, maybe the commission every now and again should rotate to go to different parts of the world so people have access to this space? I mean, as much as people would like to maybe say that CSW is not as productive as it can be, I've been going to this commission for the past 4 years now, and I can say that there's a power in the convening of all these people coming together, of the energy that is generated, the importance of renewing networks, of sharing knowledge and experience. And that, I think, fuels people for the rest of the year to go home, or if you're here based here in New York, to continue doing the work. I mean, there are many technical ways, and those who are involved in the ins and out of policy negotiations know much better than I. There are many technical ways of improving the commission. But I think making sure that this international gathering continues with the support and the attention that the issue deserves is maybe one way that we keep Beijing alive, and that we make sure that we're not just doing things on repeat, that we are every year that we're coming together, we're reflecting and we're trying to do it better than the year before.
And Bonnie, why don't I put the same question to you? In this very profoundly different geopolitical era than we were in 30 years ago, how do we keep that spirit alive?
It's extremely important for civil society and governments to be working together and for us to be reflecting on a regular basis as to how we are progressing. Violence against women is on the rise, and we've been seeing that and at alarming proportions in the kinds of violence that's on the rise. A lot of it is backlash to women advancing, women being out in the public arena, taking on leadership roles. And this seems to be a backlash coming from the frustration that some men may feel in seeing their role being usurped by women. And so I think it's really, really important. And violence is only one symptom of this backlash. There are others. And I really think it's very important for us to continue the conversation with men and boys. And this is a very important issue for the Baha'i community because we believe that as long as women are prevented from attaining their highest possibilities, so long will men be unable to achieve the greatness which might be theirs. And this is a direct quote from our writings. So it implies that unless women and men are equal in all the opportunities and in how they engage in society and for the well-being of humanity, we will not have the advancement that humanity requires. Another principle of the Baha'i faith is that gender equality is a prerequisite for peace. Baha'is remain hopeful because we know and believe that there will be peace. And this peace is going to be brokered by the governments of the world, but only when we have some of the prerequisites in place, which is gender equality being one, narrowing the gap between the extremes of wealth and poverty is another, when religions agree and all religions are in harmony. So these are just some of the prerequisites that we need to set in place before we can have a world where there's no conflict and peace and we are advancing together as a common humanity.
Is there anything else either of you wanted to add, or like a question I did not ask or a point you wanted to make?
So we at the Baha'i International Community, we of course are contributing to the policy and normative frameworks and the agenda of the Commission on the Status of Women, but we also work at the level of process and see, what is lacking and what is it that we can do to enable the conversations to happen and for the effectiveness of the UN, particularly when it comes to this issue, to be heightened. And the Beijing conference actually was the first time, because part of the platform for action was the call for the UN to create a high-level position. Up until that point, the officials at the UN that were engaged in gender equality were at the director level, at the most senior. But the Beijing conference created a post for a special advisor to the Secretary General, who was going to be an assistant Secretary General for the first time. And we were all very excited that now this person is going to have the ear of the Secretary General, and gender equality issues are going to be addressed across the board. And sadly, we didn't see that happening because even though she was a Assistant Secretary General, she didn't have much access to the Secretary General. She probably met with him for 15 minutes once a year. And then we were seeing a fragmentation of the various departments that were addressing advancement of women. There was a division for the advancement of women within the Secretariat. There was UNIFEM, which was the United Nations Fund for Women, similar to UNICEF, but probably a tenth of the budget or even less than that of UNICEF, which is the Fund for Children. And then there was INSTRAW, a research and training institute, which was in the Dominican Republic, that had no funding whatsoever. They were just fundraising to keep their electricity on in the office. And all this caused a lot of fragmentation of the issues, competition between the different agencies and departments. And so we came together as civil society, met with the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, and asked him to include in the system-wide coherence plan a question about the gender architecture at the UN. And the campaign was called the GEAR campaign, or the Gender Equality Architecture Reform Campaign. And we were very heartened because after many years of advocacy and calling for an effective entity, we finally got UN Women, which is the hybrid entity today that addresses gender equality at the UN. And it combined all those other disparate entities and programs and funds to come together in one entity as UN Women.
As regular listeners of my show know, one of my favorite maxims is that at the United Nations, process dictates outcomes. So ensconcing yourself in the process, the messy bureaucracy of creating an architecture around maintaining a focus on gender equality and women's rights at the UN means it'll actually happen. So I'm glad to have you tell the story of the GEAR campaign. And Lily, finally, what other unique contributions from the Baha'i International Community do you see as particularly resonant in advancing gender equality in multilateral forums today?
One other thing that I would point out is the contributions that the BIC is making to the international system, particularly when it comes to gender equality. These are contributions that are coming from the learning that is being generated by Baha'is in nearly every corner of the world. And what these individuals are doing, I think there's so many projects and organizations out there doing incredible work. And I think what Baha'is can contribute to this important work is having a system of education in place that's really asking of people of all ages to work on how do we improve our discernment and how do we learn to look around us in our societies and recognize when injustices are being done. And then to come together with our friends, our families, Baha'i or non-Baha'i, to come up with solutions together. Because as anybody can see, looking around the world today, any kind of law or policy that's put in place in any society, when we do that, but we don't think about how we are changing the hearts and the minds of individuals, then all these institutional safeguards that we have in place are vulnerable to changes in political ideology, in the change of governments. So I think the contributions that Baha'is are trying to make is really at the level of culture and at the level of how people build strong communities. And we hope to be able to bring these insights, of course, not into the gender equality space, but into all the other spaces that we work in. And I think this is something that we try to, really put forth in the book that we have put together in full partnership to honor, to hopefully as a appropriate way to honor this momentous anniversary of the 30 years since the Beijing conference.
Lily and Bani, thank you so much for your time and for your work.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.